calendar has turned to the month of August. If you're watching this video, I assume you know what that means. College football's back. Fall camp is underway, and we are just a few weeks away from our first college football Saturday. My name is Michael Fordham. Last year in college football, I hit it at a 55% clip and netted over 27 units. I feel even better about how we'll do this year. I would consider college football my bread and butter from a betting perspective, and I'm here to deliver college football content all throughout the preseason, and then certainly, obviously, the regular season as well. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's my main platform. You can follow me there at Fordham Betting. Like I said, I'll have tons of content on here throughout the season as well. So be sure to subscribe. That helps the channel and helps me and what I'm trying to do. So I appreciate that. If you like what you see today, feel free to leave a like and then comment as well. There are going to be feathers that are going to be ruffled today, really off the top from a very vocal fan base. So feel free to leave any trash talk or agreements in the comments. I would appreciate all of it. We've done 2 of these already. We did the ACC and the Big Ten. I gave out 1 future and 2 season win totals in the ACC and then 2 win totals in the Big Ten. This is a wide open conference. I mean, the Big 12 should be utter chaos this year. I do think the gap is closed, as you'll see. So I don't have any futures. I do think some of those middle to, I guess, lower tier teams do have some value in taking them to win the conference. But I stuck with 2 season win totals here for the Big 12. I'll go ahead and start off. I kind of already alluded to it. I'm playing Oklahoma under the 9.5 wins. It's a half unit play for me. And listen, I've said on here vocally, I'm a Texas fan. But that being said, I hate Texas A&M far more than I hate Oklahoma. I'm actually high on them this year. Last year, I bet on Oklahoma on 6 separate occasions. It didn't really even work out for me either. But the reality of it is the identity and the makeup of this Oklahoma team is going to be completely different than most fans and college football viewers are used to. I mean, you go from Lincoln Riley, who's obviously an offensive wizard kind of guy, was able to make 3 separate playoff appearances without ever really having a good defense, as you saw once they got to the playoff. Now you're shifting to Brent Venables, first-time head coach. Used to be the defensive coordinator at Oklahoma, and then obviously spent the last decade or so at Clemson. But he's a complete unknown in this role. I mean, he's never been a head coach before at this level. So I don't know how you could have a great feel about how that's going to go. But more than that, I mean, this is a roster that was ravaged by the transfer portal this offseason. You obviously lost Caleb Williams and Spencer Rattler, lost Mario Williams and Austin Stogner. Key offensive pieces as well on the other side of the ball. I do like what they brought in at quarterback. Dylan Gabriel obviously threw 66 touchdowns during his career at UCF and was poised for another big year last year if he didn't get hurt in that Louisville game. I think going into the year, he's the best quarterback in the Big 12. But how good of a running game is he going to have around him? I mean, I think Eric Gray is a serviceable back, over 5 yards per carry throughout his career, and he's good as a receiver as well. But is he really going to take them to that next level in the run game? Is Marcus Major going to fit that role? They have a really talented freshman coming in, Barnes, who could end up being that kind of explosive back. But I don't think their running game is just going to blow teams out of the water. Yeah, you got Marvin Mims back as your number 1 receiver, but losing a guy like Austin Stogner at the tight end position was huge. And I think a lot of the depth pieces throughout this wide receiver unit could just be Jags, just another guy. I mean, I think ever since, guys like D.D. Westbrook and C.D. Lamb and, Hollywood Brown have left OU, they've really struggled to find that truly elite wide receiver. And I don't know. I mean, I think Mims is by far the best chance to be that guy. But as far as depth pieces, I don't know how much is pushing those frontline units. Most importantly, up front on the offensive line, yeah, they returned 3 starters. But, I mean, if you're an Oklahoma fan, you have to – it was not a good unit last year. It's really as simple as that. And I also don't like the depth there. So defensively, I mean, Brent Venables and what he has done throughout his career as a coordinator, I mean, he's been great in that role. But as far as the makeup of this roster, I don't think the front 4 is going to be overly disruptive. There's a lot of veteran-laden offensive line units in this Big 12 conference, as you'll see throughout this video. What if any of the projected starters for OU along the front 4 shown me to think that they're going to create havoc up front? I haven't seen it. I think their frontline linebackers are pretty good, but I do worry about depth there once again. Might have to rely on some younger guys. And then their secondary has experience, but brought in a lot of transfers from some lower levels. I just building a championship level team from the transfer portal, it's hard to do. So I mean, there's going to be some really good wide receiving units, whether you look at Quentin Johnson at TCU. I think Texas has a really good frontline wide receiving unit. I mean, I'm not necessarily expecting Oklahoma to be some lockdown pass defense. So as far as their schedule, I mean, they open up UTEP and Kent State. Should be two blowout, easy wins. That game at Nebraska, I mean, that's going to be Scott Frost's Super Bowl. Obviously, Nebraska is a tough place to play historically. And with all the moving parts on this Oklahoma team, first-year coaching staff, that is an absolutely a game Oklahoma could lose. Should come back home and beat Kansas State that next week. Although Kansas State beat them 2 years ago in Norman, and then came pretty close last year as well. I'm still going to give them that win. I think at TCU, I worry about TCU too much defensively to expect them to pull off the upset. Texas is going to be a toss-up game. Obviously, I'm gonna if you're asking me like from my heart, obviously I want Texas to win. As far as like a season win total, I think that's a game that could certainly go in either direction, but certainly a losable game from Oklahoma. Kansas will be an easy win, but down the stretch of the season, that's where it's tough for first-year coaches to really hone in on their culture is when, you get to the dog days of the season. It's hard for a first-year staff with all the new pieces and everything that left. They're going to play some really sneakily tough games. I'm not necessarily high on Iowa State. They're a very unknown team, but I mean, that's not an easy place to play. That's not a surefire win for Oklahoma. At West Virginia, as you'll see in a second, I'm high on West Virginia this year. And with what they can do offensively, especially later in the year, I presume, that's anything but a surefire win. I think Oklahoma State is a very good team. Baylor is a tough out as well. Suffice to say, I just don't see this team going 10-2. I think the gap is closed in this conference. I'm not even saying that Venables wasn't the right hire because we've seen what happens to Lincoln Riley coach teams once you get to the playoff. Can't get stopped. So having a defensive-minded guy as you move into the SEC might actually be the right answer long-term. But in the short term, I think this team has too many holes, and they're not as solid and game-changing in a lot of these areas like they have been. I don't think they're a 10-win team. There's a lot of parity in this conference to assume that they're going to win some of these road games just because you like the way they match up on paper, which I'm not even saying I do like that. So if you're an OU fan, just don't be afraid to come at me in the comments and, call me biased or whatever. It's not the case. You aren't winning 10 games this year. So that's kind of my read on Oklahoma. I did play that for half a unit. And as I just alluded to, West Virginia, I played them over the 5.5 wins. This feels very similar to last year. I placed over the 5.5 wins for Kansas State. It's obviously not the same makeup of a team, but feels very like a similar style bet. I think JT Daniels is going to break out this year. I really do. Can you imagine last offseason what JT Daniels transferring to West Virginia would have done to their win total and how the betting market would have reacted? It would have been a lot more than it has been up to this point. What's changed? He just got injured. I mean, in my opinion, Georgia would have won the national title with him or Stetson Bennett. It's not a knock on Stetson Bennett. I actually think Kirby Smart made the right move by sticking with him. But, I mean, this is a former 5-star guy. Didn't really work out at USC. It looked like it was going to work out at Georgia until he got hurt, and then they were just playing so well. There's no reason to insert him. But he is going to be such a big quarterback upgrade for Neil Brown. I mean, just think about the quarterbacks Neil Brown has had these past 3 years. I mean, Austin Kendall, Jarrett Dagey, JT Daniels is far more talented than either one of those guys. And now you pair him up with Graham Harrell, who he worked with from his time at USC. I think this is actually a marriage that's going to work for Neil Brown and co. It's a very young running back room, but I would expect their run game to improve throughout the season as these guys get their feet wet. And if Daniels can, stretch the ball down the field like he proved to do in a small sample size at Georgia, then that should be the case even more so. Daniels got plenty of weapons to work with. It's pretty deep wide receiver room, and I especially like that front line unit. A big part of this offense as well, and a big part is why I am going to back West Virginia here preseason. All 5 starters on their offensive line return. I put a lot of value into how teams fare up front, probably more so than any other matchup in football. Having all 5 starters return on the offensive line is a big, big deal. I also like them on the defensive line. I think they're plenty dependable up front. I like what they have coming off the edge, which, there are some teams in this conference who struggle to get after the quarterback. I don't think West Virginia is going to be one of those teams. I think they'll be fine at linebacker. I do think some of the better rushing attacks in this conference will be able to have their way. But did get a big pickup at that position from Syracuse. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. One thing I'm just going to concede is I don't know much about this secondary. I think it's a complete mystery. They had a lot of guys picked out of the portal, and it's certainly kind of the weakest unit on this team. So I do think the better passing attacks in this conference could have their way with this pass defense. And you know, I'm willing to concede that. Like I said, this bet's at 5.5, so we're not probably getting a team that's going to win the conference. But looking at their schedule, tough start at Pitt on that Thursday night to start the year. I think that's a winnable game, but Daniels' first game at West Virginia, and I think Pitt is really good up front as well. I think that's probably a loss. Should come back and win 2 games at home against Kansas and Towson pretty easily. I think they need to win one of these next 2 road games at Virginia Tech and at Texas. Like I said, I think some of the better offenses in this conference, just given the makeup of this West Virginia defense, should be able to have their way. So I do think Texas gets that win in DKR. But I think West Virginia could go on the road and beat Virginia Tech. I mean, Justin Fuente ran Virginia Tech into the ground. They have a first-year head coach in Brent Pry. I think Grant Wells was a good pickup for Virginia Tech. But I don't know if their passing issues from a year ago will be figured out that early in the season. I think it's a winnable game for Neil Brown and co. So, those 3 road games to start the year, if they can just win one of those games, I'd feel in a pretty comfortable spot. After that bye week, obviously you get into the dog days of the Big 12 season. I think Baylor at home is a toss-up game. At Texas Tech, I think Texas Tech is going to be a volatile team this year. TCU's got lots of issues defensively. I like TCU's offense, but if you can't get stops, probably not going to win games on the road. So I do think West Virginia wins that game. We'll see what Iowa State's got. I think it's a winnable game for sure. I think they could easily beat Kansas State at home as well. For the purposes of this, I'll count Oklahoma and then add Oklahoma State as losses. But as I mentioned, I could easily see West Virginia pulling off the upset against the Sooners at home. As I look through this is a 6-win quality team at least. Could be a 7 or 8 win team. So getting 5.5, I really just don't think people are taking into account how big of an upgrade JT Daniels is from Jarret Doege. I mean, Jarret Doege is a noodle arm. JT Daniels is a legit quarterback option. I think having all 5 starters on the offensive line come back is a big deal. And I think this front 7 defensively is good enough. I'm willing to concede that West Virginia might have trouble in some of their tougher matchups, but I think there's a lot of games on the schedule that are winnable. I think as Daniels gets acclimated, this could develop into a pretty good team. So I played this over the 5.5, just minus 110 too. So very cheap in my opinion. Definitely felt that was worthy of a play. All right, guys, before I get into my breakdowns of the rest of the teams out of the Big 12, you might notice we got the flamingos on, little baby blue, little pink. You might be wondering, how can I look as cool and sexy as you? Well, I'll tell you, proud90.com. Unique polos, but very comfortable as well. Proud90's got all your golf apparel needs, whether it be a polo like this. They got more traditional polos as well that are also comfortable. T-shirts, hoodies, and quarter zips for those who want to start getting ready for the colder weather. And they also added a women's line as well. So whether you are a lady or you want to treat that special someone, Proud90's got all your golf apparel needs. Here's what you're going to do. If you're watching on YouTube, you can use the link in the description. If not, just go to proud90.com, browse their selection. If you see anything you like at checkout, as you enter your payment information, it's going to say discount code. If you enter the code Fordham, it's going to get you 15% off your entire order. Code Fordham at checkout, proud90.com. Gets you 15% off your order. Support me, support Proud90, proud90.com, code Fordham. Let's get back into the video. All right, as far as some of the rest of these teams, I mentioned I'm a Texas fan. Throughout the season, I don't really handicap Texas games. I'm a fan. I like to keep it that way. I don't want to mix those two things and start betting with my heart. With that being said, I'm just going to give you kind of my feel about where we're at, position group-wise, and then just kind of my overall sentiment on the team. Obviously brought in Quinn Ewers this offseason in a very loud way. I do think he's named the starter pretty quickly, actually. First scrimmage is next Saturday. I think he gets named it after that. I think Hudson Card has got all the ability in the world, but I don't think he has the it factor. He looked frantic and scared last year. I think Quinn Ewers wins this job. I don't want to say fairly easily, but I think it'll be unanimously. With that being said, I think a lot of people have a misconception about Steve Sarkisian. He's a run-first guy. I mean, look at what he did with Najee Harris back in 2020 at Alabama. He builds what you're going to get in the passing game off of that already established run game. And I think running back is the major strength of this Texas team. Bijan Robinson is the number one running back prospect in the country, over 6 yards per carry throughout his career. He's an elite back, but I think what makes this unit so good is the depth. The young guys have proven to be good, but Roschon Johnson, fourth-year guy, over 1,500 yards on the ground, 5.5 yards per carry. This is a really good running back unit, and I think it will be the focal point of the offense, unlike what some people might think. I also think the frontline wide receivers are good as well. I mean, Xavier Worthy obviously had a freshman All-American season last year, but bringing in Isaiah Nayer from the portal, the one thing Texas lacked last year is that one lengthy wide receiver that can stretch the field vertically. Jordan Whittington is a very dependable guy out of the slot. I think we've gotten better depth-wise at wide receiver too. Yeah, some of those guys are young, but I think there's a lot of speed and just overall talent in some of those depth pieces. Also, Tyreek Milton, veteran receiver from Iowa State, was a good safe pickup as insurance. So obviously, all those are positive signs, but the main concern around this team is the offensive line. And it's still a concern for me entering the season. Obviously, Texas just signed its best offensive line class in 15 years since 2007. 7 new faces in that room. I think 3 or 4 of those guys could be ready to play at some point this year. And maybe one of those guys, left tackle Kelvin Banks, will play immediately. But that being said, from a betting perspective, I think the O-line is a unit that if you want to go against this O-line, probably going to want to do it earlier in the season, because I do think whether it just be for continuity reasons or one of those new additions is inserted in at some point, I do think this is a unit that will get better throughout the year. That being said, I don't think it'll be a good or great unit at any point this year. If they can just be, slightly above average and certainly better than last year, that'd be more than okay with me. Moving on defensively, I think the strength of the defense is the interior defensive line. A lot of depth, a lot of experience, and they're going to have to be the strength because Texas pass rush is another concern. I mean, pass rush is by far the main concern of the defense. Didn't really add much there throughout the offseason, and there's just not very many true pass rushing threats on this team. So I think the interior defensive line is going to have to open some things up for the rest of the defense. I think the front line linebackers are solid. Jalen Ford has really emerged and added one key transfer at that position, but depth could be an issue here. So throughout the season, I point out depth all the time because in a 12-game season, you're probably going to need some of those second, maybe even third team guys. So if you don't have good depth, I think that's something to account for later in the season. I think that could apply to this Texas linebacking unit. I think secondary should be solid, but I also have my concerns there as we face some of these lethal passing attacks like we may at points this season. I don't think they're established enough yet to say they'll have the edge in those matchups. So I'm kind of in wait and see mode with the secondary. Overall, though, win total is at 8.5. Texas is the only team in the country I don't offer betting advice about because I'm a fan. I don't really want to think about them that way. But yeah, hopefully that was able to, if you had any questions about a unit at UT, hopefully that was able to answer some questions for you. Moving on to Oklahoma State. I mean, obviously had a great year last year, won 12 games. We're literally inches away from not only a Big 12 title win, but a college football playoff appearance. I mean, if they would have punched that in at the goal line, would have gotten in over Cincinnati. That being said, Spencer Sanders played like garbage in that Big 12 title game. I think he threw 4 picks, so that's not good. I mean, that Sanders is a guy that I think has the talent. I mean, it hasn't really showed overall throughout his career. I mean, 42 touchdowns to 31 interceptions. It really starts with that. He's got to start taking care of the football a little bit more. But 7.8 yards per attempt. I mean, this is a guy with a good arm. I think he has the ability to excel as a downfield passer because if he can just improve marginally in the passing game, I mean, he's got almost 1,400 yards on the ground throughout his career. He could be a big threat for Oklahoma State this year. I mean, they're probably going to have a solid run game. He's got good options around him in the skill positions. But I think another strength of this Oklahoma State team, they returned 3 starters on their offensive line. But this was a group that improved mightily throughout last season. I mean, back in 2020, Oklahoma State had a bad offensive line. And just all throughout last season, they really improved. I mean, it's just going to be hard to win 12 games without having a good O-line. So I do think that unit continues that progression here into 2022. As far as the defense, obviously the big story is Jim Knowles, defensive coordinator from last year, heading over to Ohio State. I mean, he did a great job at Oklahoma State. So it was very well deserved. I think bringing in Derek Mason, I think Mason is a tier below Knowles overall as a coordinator, but I think Derek Mason is plenty capable of excelling with this group. I mean, he's going to have a really good front four to work with, and I think Oklahoma State pass rush could be an issue for some of these bottom tier offensive lines in this conference. So Oklahoma State's really good up front on both sides of the ball. They obviously lost a lot at linebacker. I mean, Malcolm Rodriguez was one of my favorite players to watch in the country last year. Some of those younger guys filling in got some big shoes to fill because that Oklahoma State run defense was incredible last year. So probably going to regress a little bit in that area of the game. They also lose both their starting corners. They only have one returning starter in the secondary, and that's one of their safeties. So I do think there's some unknown in their secondary, but as I look at their schedule, so, win totals at 8.5. I don't know if those are surefire enough wins for Cowboys to where I'm going to be, racing to the window to bet them preseason. With that being said, I do like the overall makeup of this team. If Spencer Sanders can take that next step and just be a little bit more consistent, they've got a lot of strengths on this team. Should be in the Big 12 title game. I think that's a realistic expectation for Oklahoma State and Mike Gundy this year. All right, on to Baylor. Obviously a fairy tale 2021 season. I mean, for Dave Aranda to go from 2-7 in 2020 to what he put out last year, I mean, won the Big 12, won the Sugar Bowl in very decisive fashion against Ole Miss. Just an incredible year for Dave Aranda. I thought he made a good move this offseason too, just solving his quarterback battle after the spring. Obviously, Gary Bohannon was their starter for most of last year. He actually named Blake Shapen the starter and allowed Bohannon to find another program. Not only is it classy, but I think it's the right move. We saw Blake Shapen actually start that Big 12 title game last year. He also started the final regular season game against Tech, a game in which they needed to win to even get to the Big 12 title game. 0 picks in either one of those games, over 70% completion. I think he gives them a high floor as a thrower that maybe Gary Bohannon didn't, but he's still going to be a first-time starter. Still hasn't started a road game yet. There's still going to be a lot of firsts for Blake Shapen. I still think he's a solid option. I think the bigger deal for Baylor, though, they're going to have to replace a lot at running back. I mean, what Abram Smith was able to do last year, well over 6 yards per carry, just a beast. I mean, transition from a linebacker to a running back. There's be some big shoes to fill for some of these younger backs that probably going to be a running back by committee approach, but still should see some regression from that group. I think wide receiver is kind of a relative unknown outside of Holmes. Thankfully, they do have a reliable tight end that should be a good safety net for Shapen. Overall, I think the strength of this offense, though, is clearly the offensive line. This unit was borderline elite last year. They might regress a little bit because they don't return all 5 starters. But this is going to be a very good unit once again. And not only are they good on the offensive line, but they return their entire 2 deep in their front 4 defensively. So, right up there with Oklahoma State, this Baylor defense was phenomenal last year. The high expectations for this unit are more than warranted. Do get Dylan Doyle back at Mike linebacker. I do worry a little bit about how they're going to fill in some of the roles around him. But it still should be a solid, if not, good linebacking core once again. Do have one good cover corner returning, but I do expect some regression from the secondary. Like I said, I do expect some of these passing offenses as the year goes on to start to be able to stretch the field vertically. I'm not so sure I'm going to trust Baylor in those kind of matchups, especially if that opposition has got a good offensive line. Seeing their win total at 7.5, it's also heavily juiced towards the over. So Vegas has refused to move that number to 8. A little bit fishy in my mind. Very tough test early in the season. Going to BYU, I think at Iowa State is certainly not a surefire win. I think at West Virginia is a toss-up game. Kansas State's a toss-up game. And I'm also not going to expect them preseason to go on the road and beat Oklahoma or Texas. So I do think the 7.5 is fair. With that being said, I think Dave Aranda has earned the benefit of the doubt. Remember, I think Baylor was 8th in the preseason polls last year. So when you're as good up front as Baylor's going to be this year, they should be in every game they play. Now, it's a different thing if they're going to be able to finish some of those games and be able to put points up. But I think their front 4 on each side of the ball could take this team far. All right, TCU, obviously the first year of Sonny Dykes. Gary Patterson was there for my whole lifetime. Maybe. I'm 22. He was there for a long time. Long term, I'm not a big Sonny Dykes guy. With that being said, he inherits what could be a pretty good offense. I like each of these quarterback options with Max Duggan and Chandler Morris. Both guys are mobile. I mean, Duggan's got over 1,300 yards in his college career. He also progressed as a passer way more than I thought. I mean, 9 yards per attempt last year was impressive. But, on the other hand, Chandler Morris, 461 yards through the air, 2 touchdowns to no interceptions, and that upset win against Baylor. He played phenomenal in that game. I think both those guys are certainly good options for Dykes and company. I think this could be an explosive running game too. Kendry Miller is a guy who was much more of a change of pace guy last year, but 7.5 yards per carry, over 600 yards on the ground. Obviously it's going to be a new role for him. Being more of a high usage guy, but I do think TCU will need to develop some of its depth at that position. But I do think Miller has shown plenty enough to think that he should be able to break off some pretty big runs this year. Dykes might have one of the best wide receivers in college football. Quentin Johnson is gonna break out this year. I'm very confident about that. Very lengthy guy off the outside that can certainly win those one-on-one battles deep. I'm very, very high on Quentin Johnson. I think they got solid slot options. They also added Jared Wiley, who's a good receiving tight end out of Texas. So I think they're dependable enough at tackle and center. It shouldn't be a liability for this unit. I'm actually high on this offense. That's the good part. This defense could very well stink. I know Joe Gillespie ran some good defenses at Tulsa. This could be the worst front four in the Big 12. I mean, I wouldn't feel solid about that at all if I were a TCU fan. Major question marks up front. I think they'll be okay at linebacker, but certainly should be able to get gashed by some of the better rushing attacks in this conference. They have Travius Hodges-Tomlinson, who's a 2-time All Big 12 corner, but he's really their only key guy in the secondary. I think the other spots, both at safety and then that other corner position or nickel, could be pretty shaky. So it's kind of a tale of both worlds. I feel good about the offense, and I have major concerns about the defense. The best way to approach TCU this year might just be to blindly bet the over, because it'll probably make you money before everything's said and done. I actually think that opener at Colorado is a favorable matchup. Should win that game. I think at SMU in week 4 is probably the tougher matchup, and the one I'd certainly be more nervous about. It's just hard to know with first-year head coaches, how those teams are going to respond when stepping up in competition. On paper, I mean, I don't think they beat Oklahoma State, Kansas State, at West Virginia. I mean, those are all tough games. At Texas and at Baylor, don't feel good about those either. Should beat Texas Tech at home. We'll talk about them in a little bit. I think Iowa State at home to close the year is a winnable game. Their win total is at 6.5. I'd lean under. I mean, I think they're probably a 6-6 team. The reality of it is, if you can't get stops, it's going to be hard for you to win on the road in this conference. So I think there's some variance to the TCU team. I tend to lean under the 6.5. I like this offense, but have some major concerns about the defensive side of the ball in the aftermath of the Gary Patterson era. Moving on to Kansas State, I was this close to betting their win total over 7. There are some 6.5s out there, but it's -165, -170. That's not my style, and I don't advocate for laying that much juice. But I do think this is a 7-win team with the upside to be a little bit better. Obviously, have to replace Skylar Thompson, who I think was vital to their success in past seasons. Bring in Adrian Martinez from Nebraska. I think he gets a bad rap. I think a lot of the blame of Nebraska's failure last year, going 3-9, a lot of that was placed on Martinez. I tend to think that that's more so on Scott Frost and his staff. I mean, they repeatedly just could not win late in games, and it wasn't just because of the offense. The special teams stunk. Nebraska had much bigger issues than quarterback. I mean, Martinez 9.4 yards per attempt last year. He made strides as a passer. He's got to clean up the interceptions, but this is a dual threat guy. Well over 2,000 yards on the ground throughout his career. I actually like this pickup for Chris Kleiman if he can take care of the football and not let's just call it what it is, choke in the fourth quarter. The reality of it is, though, this offense is centered around Deuce Vaughn. I mean, Deuce Vaughn is one of the most electrifying running backs or just players in college football. Almost 6 yards per carry and 15 touchdowns last year, 1,250 yards. Also had almost 500 yards out of the backfield as a receiver. I mean, Deuce Vaughn is small, but he makes a big impact. I think Martinez will have plenty of frontline wide receivers to work with as well. Do worry because they did lose their starting tight end, and I don't feel great about the depth at that position. But by far, my main concern offensively is their offensive line. And the reality of it is that's a position I put so much stock into. We saw Martinez struggle at Nebraska, partly because he didn't have a great offensive line in front of him. I don't think it'll be the same situation this year, but really the offensive line concerns is kind of what keeps me off of their season one total over, because as far as the defense, I love their front four. I have high expectations for them. They have both of their starting cornerbacks returning. Their secondary was highly effective a year ago. Yeah, they got to fill one linebacker role, and yeah, they got to integrate some of those younger safeties, but I feel good about this defense once again. I think they can win up front, and then I think they're actually going to match up well with a team like Texas, with some of these teams that can be lethal through the air, very experienced in their secondary or at the cornerback position. I don't really worry about that Missouri game at home week 2. I think Missouri's got too many quarterback problems and just overall issues defensively. So I do think Kansas State takes care of that game. You have to chalk up Oklahoma as a loss right now, but by all intents and purposes, I expect them to start the year off 4-1. I think at Iowa State and at TCU, I could see them dropping one of those games, but it's really later in the season. I mean, when you get to Oklahoma State and Texas, and then on the road at Baylor, then at West Virginia, I could see all those games going either way. I think all of those can be classified somewhat as toss-up games, and that's how I view it preseason. So, it's really just the offensive line, and still have slight concerns about Martinez late in games. With that being said, I had a great feel for Kansas State last year. I bet their season one total over, which cashed easily. I was on their unders a lot because they ran such slow tempo and had very good defense as well. It'll be one question I have is, I know Colin Klein is the new offensive coordinator. He's talked about wanting to be more aggressive and try to play with more tempo. That's not what they were at all last year. So I wonder how that impacts things. Suffice to say, I think Kansas State's always an underrated program and should be a team I back pretty routinely this season. All right, moving on to Iowa State. I mean, let's just call it what it is, Iowa State fans. With all the senior leadership you had last year, going 7-6 was a huge disappointment. I mean, you had a senior quarterback. You had one of the best running backs in the country, great tight ends, great front seven. I mean, 7-6 was a huge disappointment. So the team's got a lot to replace. The heir apparent at quarterback is Hunter Dekkers. I mean, 6'3", 235. Definitely a much different build than a guy like Brock Purdy. I will say the one thing about Dekkers, he did get experience last year, came in and replaced Purdy in both that Iowa game early in the season when Purdy was ineffective, and then also on the road at Oklahoma when Purdy got absolutely crushed, as you see right here. At the end of the day, though, we don't know how Hunter Dekkers is going to work out. Matt Campbell is confident, and his confidence, and he just didn't really go out in the portal and fill some of these issues. He's building from within. Part of me kind of likes that and respects that, but he's a total unknown at this point throughout the course of a 12-game season. I think the bigger loss certainly is losing Breece Hall. They do inherit Jarrell Brock, but less than 5 yards per carry. Just didn't have that much of a sample size. I think they certainly regress in the run game. Xavier Hutchinson is a guy on the outside to watch out for. I think having a guy like that will certainly help out an inexperienced quarterback like Dekkers. And overall, I think they have good depth at that wide receiver position. It'd be great if Charlie Kohler and just some of the – and they had another tight end as well. It's slipping my mind. But they had a really good tight end room last year. That would be maybe an even bigger strength pairing with a young quarterback. So it hurts not having those guys. One strength of this team, though, veteran-laden offensive line. And I put a lot of stock in that position, as I said. So I do feel good about that. But until we see how Dekkers adjusts to being the guy, it's hard for me to have a great feel about this offense as a whole. Defensively, they have a lot to replace as well. I mean, they have younger guys across their interior defensive line. Could be a threat off the edge. That's something to watch out for. But Mike Rose was another one of those guys that I loved watching. They still do inherit a pretty good front line linebacking core, but I do worry about some of the younger depth at that position. Maybe having to fill in before they're ready. It's like the quarterback position. Matt Campbell didn't, go out and try to fix some of their secondary inexperience through the portal. He trusts his development. He trusts his staff. Like I said, part of me likes it, but this is just a very unknown team. I mean, would I be surprised if Iowa State went 5-7? Not really, but Would I be surprised if they went 8-4? Not really either. So I feel pretty comfortable that they won't go to Iowa City and win that game. I think Baylor's a tough game early in the season. We'll see if they can pull off a home upset like Kansas State or Oklahoma. I think at Texas is a tough game. I think West Virginia and then at TCU, Texas Tech, those are more realistic wins. I also expect this team to play better down the stretch of the season. I think Deckers will only get better with time. I think some of their defensive, worries I have will probably get solved over time. So, probably not going to step up well in competition over the first half of the season, but, could surprise some people and make some noise later in the year. Suffice to say, it's just hard to have a great feel for Iowa State at the moment. All right, just two more schools to go. Texas Tech, obviously first-year head coach Joey McGuire, very interesting hire. I mean, he was a well-known commodity around the Texas high school coaching ranks. I happen to be from Texas, so I've heard that name for a while. Was on the Baylor staff and then gets hired as the Texas Tech head coach. I'm bullish on Texas Tech long-term. They made a splash of an offensive coordinator hire. Zack Kittley got hired from Western Kentucky. This guy's just 30 years old. This is a name that you're going to hear for a long time. I mean, Western Kentucky's offense last year was lethal. I wouldn't even call it an air raid offense. I would call it just the most aggressive passing offense in the country. I mean, Bailey Zappi set a new NCAA passing record for a single season, and Kittley just did such a good job with that Hilltopper unit. My main question around this team is how much can Zack Kittley do what he wants to do with this current roster? I don't think Tyler Shuck is necessarily built to chuck the ball around 50 times a game. I mean, he has been pretty productive up to this point in his career. I mean, over 9 yards per attempt. And he's pretty mobile as well, but he's coming off a major injury. And he's never really played a full season. So I don't know if that's necessarily the guy made for this system. I know Donovan Smith is not. I know Smith played pretty well at times last year, but the reality of it is I think he's meant much more for a balanced system. So I think Shuck is the guy, but Kittley might not have his guy on campus yet. Maybe it's Bayron Morton, who right now is the third string quarterback. Matt Wells was actually somebody who did like to run the football. Western Kentucky didn't run a lot last year, so I'm just kind of curious as to how he's going to use his running backs. He doesn't have a great wide receiver unit. I mean, lost a lot off of last year's team. Can one of these quarterbacks find a go-to guy this year? And then up front as well, they lose 3 starters on the offensive line. Brought in some transfers. I tend not to think that those tend to make a team all that much better. So I have my just overall questions about this offense. Defensively, I think they're good up front. I think that's certainly their strength on that side of the ball is in their front four. But they lost a lot at linebacker. I mean, Colin Schooler, tough guy to replace. I think that just hard shoes to fill across the board at that second level. I could absolutely see them getting gashed against the run. And then it's going to be a really young secondary. Joey McGuire has expressed confidence in that group, but I certainly have my worries as well. Seeing their win total at 5.5, I think it's fair. I'll tell you, they're not going to Raleigh and beating NC State. I played NC State plus 830 to win the ACC. Think they're a really complete team. Texas Tech is not winning that game. They could beat Houston at home early in the season. I think that'll be a good game. I'm in wait and see mode on Texas Tech. We'll see how they look week 1. I just don't know how quickly Kittley can make some of those offensive adjustments because, I know Texas Tech is known for the air raid, but they actually ran the football a lot under Matt Wells. It'll be interesting to see how quickly they adjust. Obviously, it's going to be a pretty tough schedule. And aside from Kansas, none of these conference games really stick out as a clear win. They could make noise at home against Texas. I think they should be competitive on the road against TCU. We'll see how Iowa State looks. I think West Virginia at home is a winnable game. Probably going to have a lot of my questions answered, though, pretty early in the season. I think that Houston team will be a perfect barometer about where this team is at and probably how they'll fare this year in the Big 12. All right, I don't want to spend all that much time on Kansas. They went 2-10 last year. Don't ask me about where one of those wins was. Listen, Kansas is still got ways to go. There's only year 2 of Lance Leipold. I don't think this is a horrible team. There's been much worse Kansas teams than we'll see this year. The reality of it is, though, I can't expect them to win any of these conference games. I mean, they should win week 1 against Tennessee Tech, and they should beat Duke at home. I mean, Duke is in a bad place right now. Mike Elko's got a huge rebuilding job on his hands. Jalen Daniels is not a bad quarterback option. Almost at 70% last year. He's not much of a threat down the field, but he is pretty efficient. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a run-first team. They're really only going to go as far as their offensive line lets them. I think their starting offensive line should be okay. If one and certainly two of those guys gets hurt, I think depth up front is still a major, major concern for this Kansas team. As far as defensively, their biggest weakness by far is their secondary. I think most offenses in the Big 12 should be able to pick on them in a pretty big way. Yeah, I mean, their front seven is not terrible, but still, I think Kansas will probably just be outmatched in most of these Big 12 games. I know a lot of people love to do, bet like Kansas over the 2.5. I think it was at 1.5 last year, so it would have cashed. That's not my style. I still think that they've got ways to go. I don't mind the Lance Leipold hire. I'm not going to go out on that far of a limb and say they're close this year. All righty, guys, that's going to do it for today's video. Appreciate everybody tuning in. I think this is a wide open conference. We could see cannibalism in this conference. I don't have a great feel as to who even makes the conference title game. I think there's a lot of parity here in the Big 12. I did feel good about those 2-season win totals. That's just kind of my opinion on the Big 12 heading into 2022. Once again, I want to thank everybody for watching. If you enjoyed the video and you got this far, please leave a like. And if you're not subscribed, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the upcoming content. This video is going to get some negative comments, so I will be live in the comments defending my name. Next up, we're going to have the Pac-12. At some point this upcoming week, we will have the Pac-12 preview video, and then we're going to round it out with the SEC. After that, we should be close enough to the season where we should be breaking down some actual games, which, hallelujah. That's all I'll say. So, like I said, thank you for watching the video. Like, subscribe, comment, follow me on Twitter at Fordham Betting. And yeah, I'll be back in a few days. I'll catch you on the flip side. Thank you for all the support, and I'll see you here soon.